1,000 lives seemed to be concentrated in that one moment to Eliza. Her room opened by a side door to the river. She caught her child and sprang down the steps towards it. The trader caught a full glimpse of her just as she was disappearing down the bank, and throwing himself from his horse, he was after her like a hound after a deer. In that dizzy moment, her feet to her scarce seemed to touch the ground, and a moment brought her to the water's edge. Right on behind they came, and nerved with strength such as God gives only to the desperate, with one wild cry, flying leap, she vaulted sheer over the turbid current by the shore, onto the raft of ice beyond. It was a desperate leap, impossible to anything but madness and despair.
That scene, from the best-selling book of all time, inflamed its readers with a passion for bringing freedom to the slaves of the South. Of course, not all of the public was of a similar mind. In the decades since the founding of the United States, American attitudes toward slavery hardened and grew more and more sectarian. The South shifted from apologizing for slavery as a necessary evil to proclaiming it as a positive good. Evangelicals of the North fostered abolitionist attitudes and welcomed fugitive slaves to join and lead their cause. Step by step, the factions of North and South brought the nation closer to war and up from slavery.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
After the American Revolution and the Constitutional Convention, it seemed to many as if the practice of slavery would die a slow death. Northern states emancipated their slaves, gradually in most cases. But even in some southern states, it seemed that the public conscience was beginning to question the morality of slavery. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both wanted slavery to end, though neither could see a successful means of emancipating hundreds of thousands of slaves. Should slave owners be reimbursed, and if so, by whom and for how much? Where would all these former slaves now live, and how? Many would not know how to live in a free society, and the eldest slaves might not be able to take care of themselves. And could the former slaves truly live peacefully among former masters? Could these two visibly different races mesh together into a single civil society? History provided no successful examples for guidance. Should freed African slaves be repatriated to their former homes? What about African American slaves, many of whom could trace their ancestry in America back as far or farther than the founding fathers themselves? Hard questions, and no clear, practical answers could be seen in the late 18th century. Nonetheless, actions taken during the Revolution by the early Congress and in the Constitutional Convention suggested that freedom was on the march for the slaves as well as for the newly independent America. Many American leaders, such as George Washington, had witnessed slave and free black soldiers fighting the British. Some could no longer pretend that men of African descent loved or deserved freedom less than men of English stock. The Northwest Ordinance identified a massive territory where slavery would be outlawed from the beginning. The planned end of the international slave trade drew another clear line in the sand. Finally, falling prices for tobacco and indigo, combined with the soil depletion from tobacco cultivation, made slavery less profitable, particularly in Virginia and Maryland. These states now had more slaves than they needed, which means they had more than they could afford. In Virginia, manumission of slaves by individual slave owners was made legal in 1782, and it appears that roughly 1,000 slaves per year were freed between that year and 1806. Things changed with the invention of the cotton gin. Eli Whitney's invention removed the seeds and trash from the short staple cotton that grew so well in the South. Before the cotton gin, short staple cotton had to be combed by hand, an incredibly labor-intensive process. Whitney's machine didn't take all of the intense labor out of cotton. It removed the time-consuming bottleneck of combing cotton, which meant that now cotton plantations could process enormous amounts of cotton far more quickly than ever before. Plantations needed to get more cotton out of the fields faster. And to do that cheaply, they needed slaves. The growth in slavery driven by cotton changed slavery from a British-created institution that Jefferson could say had been forced upon the colonies into a truly American engine of industry. The backbreaking work of picking cotton had slaves dragging a long, heavy bag through a field as they spent 10, 12, even 15 hours stooped over in the blazing sun. This became the quintessential image of slavery in America. And indeed, cotton plantations would absorb the vast majority of slaves. By 1850, about 75% of American slaves were in the service of King Cotton. Eventually, the South would produce 75% of the world's cotton, and cotton would represent 60% of America's exports. The Industrial Revolution brought the development of factories that could produce cotton cloth on levels never before seen, but they needed cotton to do it. By 1860, Britain was importing 5 million bales of cotton annually. Cotton became such an important part of the American and European economy that one South Carolina senator crowned the product King Cotton. In 1858, Senator James Henry Hammond boasted,
"What would happen if no cotton was furnished for 3 years? I will not stop to depict what everyone can imagine, but this is certain. England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her, save the South. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." Until lately, the Bank of England was king, but she tried to put her screws upon the cotton crop and was utterly vanquished. The last power has been conquered. Who can doubt that has looked at recent events that cotton is supreme?
Paralleling the rise of cotton was the growth of the abolitionists. Initially, the abolitionist movement was limited to Quakers, who persuaded members to give up their slaves. Following the American Revolution, the movement grew, with more and more people calling for the end of slavery. They were driven by the revolutionary ideology of all men being created equal, and by the Great Awakening, an evangelical Christian revival that swept across the nation in the early 19th century. In the 1820s and 30s, the most prominent such group was the American Colonization Society. The ACS sought to free black slaves and repatriate them to Africa. In 1821, the ACS established the colony of Liberia for this purpose, and helped thousands of former slaves and free blacks resettle there. At the time, even many abolitionists thought it unlikely that African Americans could ever be fully accepted by white Americans. The prejudices ingrained in the public over the centuries of slavery seemed to have created an insurmountable obstacle to a completely integrated society. This idea would be challenged and overthrown by one of America's fiercest opponents of slavery. Born in Massachusetts in 1805, William Lloyd Garrison joined ACS in his 20s, but over time became disenchanted with their goals. What originally seemed to be a genuine desire to free slaves and provide them with a better life now seemed to Garrison to be more about pushing free blacks out of the country, where they would not pose a threat to lower-class white workers. In 1831, Garrison published his first edition of the anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. In the inaugural issue, he wrote,
"Assenting to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population." In Park Street Church on the 4th of July, 1829, in an impassioned address on slavery, I unreflectingly assented to the popular but pernicious doctrine of gradual abolition. I seized this opportunity to make a full and unequivocal recantation, and thus publicly to ask pardon of my God, of my country, and of my brethren the poor slaves, for having uttered a sentiment so full of timidity, injustice, and absurdity.
In the pages of The Liberator, Garrison called for the immediate emancipation of all slaves in America. He would continue publishing his weekly paper until the end of the Civil War. Garrison helped found the New England Anti-Slavery Society and the American Anti-Slavery Society, and became recognized as one of America's most radical abolitionists. He called the U.S. Constitution a pro-slavery document, and in 1844, he publicly burned a copy. He also called for the breakup of the Union so that the North would not be tied to Southern slavery. He even advocated against voting, believing it would be participation in a government corrupted by slavery.
I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not a cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or to speak or write with moderation. No. No. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest, and I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard.
He was heard. Garrison also promoted women's suffrage and demanded that women be allowed to take leadership positions in the abolitionist movement. Garrison became a mentor to other abolitionists, some of whom would rise as high as he, or higher, within the movement.
In the month of August 1841, I attended an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, at which it was my happiness to become acquainted with Frederick Douglass. Having recently made his escape from the Southern prison house of bondage, I shall never forget his first speech at that convention, the extraordinary emotion it excited in my own mind, the powerful impression it created upon a crowded auditory, completely taken by surprise, the applause which followed from the beginning to the end of his felicitous remarks. I think I never hated slavery so intensely as at that moment. It is certainly a very remarkable fact that one of the most efficient advocates of the slave population now before the public is a fugitive slave in the person of Frederick Douglass.
Garrison would not be the only one struck by the power of Frederick Douglass's words. Born into slavery in Maryland in 1818, Douglass fought to learn to read and write as a child. He described the experience.
I lived in Master Hugh's family for about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. My mistress was a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul, she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. Very soon after, I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Aud. She very kindly commenced to teach me the ABCs. And after I learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 and 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Aud found out what was going on and at once forbade Miss Aud to instruct me any further, telling her, amongst other things, that it was unlawful, as well as unsafe, to teach a slave to read. To use his own words, he said, "A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as it is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. If you teach that nigger how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave."
As his master had predicted, reading opened doors in Douglass's mind, leading him to regret evermore his condition as a slave.
And the more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I loathed them as being the meanest, as well as the most wicked of men. I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without a remedy. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking.
He was seldom punished physically and always had enough food to eat. But deaths and family squabbles among his owners led him to be changed hands several times. Perhaps serving relatively kind masters, perhaps suffering brutal mistreatment. His longing for freedom did not end, and in 1838, he took his chance. At the time, he was in Baltimore.
In the early part of the year 1838, I became quite restless. I could see no reason why I should, at the end of each week, pour the reward of my toil into the purse of my master.
Douglass, now free, married Anna Murray, a free black woman he had known in Baltimore. They moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he found work and subscribed to Garrison's weekly Liberator.
The paper became my meat and my drink. My soul was set all afire. Its sympathy for my brethren in bounds, its scratching denunciation of the slave owners, its faithful exposure of slavery, and its powerful attack upon the upholders of the institution sent a thrill of joy through my soul, such as I had never felt before.
Soon Douglass joined the abolitionist movement and made the speech that introduced him to Garrison. He gave another speech at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's annual convention, which led to his being asked to become a lecturer for the society for 3 years. Thus was launched the career that would make him famous across the nation and around the world. For years, Garrison was a mentor to Douglass, writing the introduction to Douglass's best-selling autobiography in 1845. In 1847, Douglass began publishing his own weekly anti-slavery paper, the North Star, and his views on abolition began to change.
Upon the reconsideration of the whole subject, I became convinced that there was no necessity for dissolving the union between the Northern and the Southern slaves. That to seek this dissolution was no part of my duty as an abolitionist. That to abstain from voting was to refuse to exercise a legitimate and powerful means for abolishing slavery. And that the Constitution of the United States not only contained no guarantees in favor of slavery, but on the contrary, it is, in its letter and spirit, an anti-slavery instrument, demanding the abolition of slavery as a condition of its own existence, as the supreme law of the land.
Garrison saw this change of position as a betrayal of their cause and suggested that it was prompted by a desire to increase sales of Douglass's paper. The disagreements between the two grew bitter and public and resisted all efforts at reconciliation. Even the famed writer, Harriet Beecher Stowe, tried and failed to bring the two former friends back together. Harriet Beecher Stowe grew up hearing her father preach against slavery. He supported the colonization movement and the creation of a Liberia as a new home for freed slaves. Later, Stowe and her husband Calvin assisted runaway slaves in reaching Canada and heard their stories firsthand. The Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 hardened Stowe's resolve to fight against slavery. The original fugitive slave law in 1793 had made it illegal to give aid to runaway slaves. However, that law left responsibility for enforcement to the states. Northern states and their citizens were not required to assist in capture of runaways, and as a result, fugitive slaves could live in relative freedom once they reached the North. Under the new law, however, all fugitive slave cases would be handled by federal officials. Any federal marshal who did not assist in the capture of a runaway slave would be subject to a fine of $1,000. Any person aiding a suspected fugitive slave faced a similar fine and up to 6 months imprisonment. The only evidence needed for the arrest of an accused runaway was the sworn testimony of the alleged owner. Accused runaways could not receive a trial or testify on their behalf. Not surprisingly, it is believed that many free blacks were caught up in this act, captured by agents working for Southern planters and unable to offer a word in their own defense. Also unsurprisingly, this law outraged abolitionists such as Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe was infuriated, believing the law sought to make her complicit in an immoral system. Her sister-in-law, Isabella Porter Beecher, wrote to Stowe, "If I could use a pen like you, Hattie, I would write something that would show the entire world what an accursed thing slavery is." Stowe, already a writer, resolved to do just that. The result was successful beyond anyone's expectations. Written in 1851 as a serial story published in the anti-slavery newspaper The National Era, Uncle Tom's Cabin was collected and sold as a book in 1852. It sold 300,000 copies within a year and 2 million in 2 years. Telling the story of slaves suffering under, escaping from, and dying in slavery, Stowe's book spread her own outrage into the hearts and minds of millions of readers. The story of the young slave mother. Eliza's escape from a slave trader captured the imaginations of her readers. Stowe later explained that,
I wrote what I did because as a woman, as a mother, I was oppressed and brokenhearted with the sorrows and injustice I saw. Because as a Christian, I felt the dishonor to Christianity. Because as a lover of my country, I trembled at the coming day of wrath.
Legend has it that when Stowe met Abraham Lincoln, he joked that she had helped bring that day of wrath, saying, "So you're the little lady whose book started this great war." That little lady was not the only opponent of the Fugitive Slave Act, and despite the law, many slaves still managed to escape, and many ordinary citizens risked their own freedom to help them. The slave Henry Brown found a white store owner in Richmond, Virginia, who was willing to help him with a daring plan of escape.
One day, when I was at work, my thoughts were eagerly feasting upon the idea of freedom. I felt my soul called out to heaven and breathed a prayer to the Almighty God that He would lend me His aid in bursting my fetters asunder. In a box, and getting myself conveyed as dry goods to a free state. The box which I had procured was 3 feet 1 inch wide, 2 feet 6 inches high, and 2 feet wide. And on the morning of the 29th day of March, I went into the box, having previously bought 3 gimlet holes opposite my face for air, and provided myself with a bladder of water, both for the purpose of quenching my thirst and for wetting my face, should I feel getting faint. I took the gimlet also with me, in order that I might bore holes if I found I had not sufficient air. Being thus equipped for the battle of liberty, my friends nailed down the lid and had me conveyed to the express office.
Often along the journey, Brown's box was packed upside down.
I was only 27 hours in the box, though traveling a distance of 350 miles.
Of course, the Underground Railroad did not actually involve tickets or trains. Begun in the early 1800s, the so-called railroad was most active in the final decade before the Civil War. Free blacks, former slaves, and white abolitionists worked together to aid slaves who had escaped their masters and sought freedom in the northern states or Canada. Exact numbers are impossible to determine, but some estimate as many as 100,000 slaves were carried to freedom on the railroad. More conservative estimates suggest that about 1,000 slaves a year were freed. The most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. Born a slave in Maryland in 1822, Harriet's first major stand in defense of other slaves was in her early teens. While on errands for her master, she met another slave who was away from his plantation without permission. The slave's overseer shouted for Harriet to help restrain the other slave, but she refused. The overseer hurled a heavy object at the escaping slave, but he missed his target and instead struck Tubman a serious blow on the head. She would suffer from the injury for the rest of her life, experiencing seizures and collapsing into unconsciousness. In 1849, Tubman's owner died, and she feared that she and her family would be sold apart from each other. She escaped, using the Underground Railroad's network of agents to help her reach Pennsylvania and freedom. She was overjoyed to be free, but soon began to miss her family.
I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in Maryland. because my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were there. But I was free, and they should be free.
Not long after Tubman's escape, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, making both escape and continued freedom more difficult. Before the end of that year, Harriet Tubman made her first trip back south to rescue her niece and her young children from slavery in Maryland. Working with fellow abolitionists in the Underground Railroad, Harriet would make about 20 such trips over the next 10 years, leading 300 slaves to freedom. At times, slaves in her charge, or passengers as she called them, would sometimes become overwhelmed with fear of what would happen if they were caught. Tubman would raise the rifle she carried with her and make it absolutely clear.
You'll be free or die.
Tubman's exploits did not go unnoticed in the South. Southern planters put a bounty on her head of $40,000, dead or alive. But no one was ever able to collect that reward. Harriet Tubman became friends with many of the great abolitionists of the day, including William Lloyd Garrison, who dubbed her Moses Tubman, and John Brown, whose deadly raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 would be one of the final steps on the way to civil war. Tubman conferred with Brown as he made his fateful plans and provided what assistance she could in raising men for the assault. She did not join in the raid itself, most likely due to being bedridden by her old head injury. Once the Civil War began, Tubman's efforts on behalf of freedom continued. She served first as a nurse, then as scout to Union troops in South Carolina. Before Harriet Tubman, another woman escaped slavery to become a hero of the abolitionist movement. Born in New York in 1797, the woman who would change her name to Sojourner Truth walked away from her master in 1826. In 1827, she would legally have been freed anyway, as part of New York's gradual emancipation. But she believed her master had plans to hold her or perhaps sell her south before that date, so she escaped with her infant daughter. She was forced to leave her other children behind, however, and one boy, Peter, was in fact sold illegally to an Alabama planter. She was able to bring the issue to court and became one of the first African-American women to succeed in a legal case against a white man. She would raise Peter in New York City, but in 1842, he was lost at sea. The following year, she took the name Sojourner Truth and began her career as an activist for the abolition of slavery and the rights of women. Truth met other leaders such as Douglass and Garrison. Garrison published her autobiography, which was dictated to a friend. In 1851, Truth gave her most famous speech. Later called the Ain't I a Woman speech, she argued on behalf of women's rights.
I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and eat as much too, if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man have a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we'll take too much. for we can't take more than our pint will hold. The poor man sees it to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have woman's rights, give it to her and you feel better.
Against the flood of abolitionists, there stood a wall of Southern planters and their representatives in the Congress and Senate. South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond, who crowned Cotton King, and before him, South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun were among the most prominent voices. In the 1830s and 40s, Calhoun led the pro-slavery faction in the Senate. He directly opposed abolitionism and was a major advocate of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. Calhoun is perhaps most famous, or infamous, for his 1837 speech on the Senate floor in which he described slavery not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good.
Abolition and the Union cannot coexist. As the friend of the Union, I openly proclaim it, and the sooner it is known, the better. We of the South will not, cannot surrender our institutions. To maintain the existing relations between the two races inhabiting that section of the Union is indispensable to the peace and happiness of both. It cannot be subverted without drenching the country in blood. Be it good or bad, it has grown up with our society and institutions and is so interwoven with them that to destroy it would be to destroy us as a people. But let me not be understood as admitting, even by implication, that the existing relations between the two races in the slave-holding states isn't evil. Far otherwise, I hold it to be a good, as it has thus far proved itself to be both and will continue to prove so if not disturbed by the fell spirit of abolition. I appeal to facts. Never before has the black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and so improved not only physically but morally and intellectually. It came among us in a low, degraded, and savage condition, and in the course of a few generations it has grown up under the fostering care of our institutions, as reviled as they have been, to its present comparatively civilized condition. This, with the rapid increase of numbers, is conclusive proof of the general happiness of the race, in spite of all the exaggerated tales to the contrary. The relation now existing in the slave-holding states between the two races is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good.
Frederick Douglass, years later, provided a response to Calhoun's claims of the general happiness of the race.
We are sometimes told of the contentment of slaves and are entertained with the vivid pictures of their happiness. We are told that they often dance and sing, that their masters frequently give them the wherewithal to make merry, that they have little of which to complain. I admit that the slave does sometimes sing and dance and appear to be merry. But what does this prove? It only proves to my mind that though slavery is armed with 1,000 stings, it is not able to entirely kill the elastic spirit of the bondman.
The lines were being drawn, and the sides were being chosen. Each group grew angrier and more willing to use violence to promote their cause. For good or ill, each slave's escape, every crack of the whip, and every speech for or against the practice of enslavement lifted the country one rung further on the ladder up from slavery.
Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside. down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. 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 Ain't gonna study war no more.
I'm gonna stick my sword in the golden sand.
Down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. Down by the riverside.
I'm gonna stick my sword in the golden sand.
Down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more.
Ain't gonna
Study war no more.
I ain't gonna
Study war no more.
Ain't gonna
Study war no more.
Ain't gonna
Study war no more. Gonna put on my long white robe down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. I'm gonna put on my long white robe down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. 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 Ain't gonna study war no more.
Gonna put on my starry crown.
Down by the riverside. Down by the riverside.
Down
by the riverside.
Gonna put on my starry crown.
Down by the riverside.